Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Well, Dr. Weinstein, it's time to do another one. I'm excited about going into part two with Dr. Andy Maccabe, Executive Director of AAVMC. Before we get started, though, I want to make sure that I note that this is sponsored by Nationwide, and we appreciate that they've had the courage to sponsor our meandering conversations at times. And I also like to thank our listeners for picking us up. Peter, you'd like to say anything?
I'd just like to welcome Dr. Maccabe back, and I especially want to give a shout out to Oscar the Wonder Cat, who has been a part of our conversation. And as I mentioned in one of the earlier conversations, reminds me of my cat named Whitey that I grew up with in the 60s. Towards the end of our last conversation, Andy, you were talking about students and avatars. And to me, that's technology, which is really part of this whole change that we're going through as a world, let alone as a profession. I mean, when I started reading about what ChatGPT can do, it's like, OMG, where are we headed? My concern is not the high tech, but the high touch. I am really concerned about the head and the heart and what's going to happen with that in our ever-changing world, because I do think a lot of the dressors that we see in all fields, but that seem to be maybe exacerbated in the healthcare fields, nursing, primary care, and veterinary medicine and first responders, the well-being side of things, we talk about it a lot, and I think we need to focus on it. So from the educator's standpoint, as the head of the AAVMC, can you enlighten me about how important the conversations you have with the deans are when it comes to student well-being?
Well, it's a significant issue for us. And by the way, Peter, it's not limited to students. That was what I'd call the tip of the spear. It was because of challenges that several of our schools were having, the students were having at those schools, that some of the associate deans came together to talk about this as a more widespread issue than had previously been identified. But as we look into it, it applies across the board. We've got issues with faculty, with residents and interns, and with students and with staff. And many of them have similar root causes or are at least influenced by similar things. Specifically, the environment, right? It's the system sometimes that is creating the problem or driving the behavior that results in well-being challenges.
So it seems that the only group that isn't suffering from burnout or problems with well-being are the deans and other administrators. I'm being facetious here. I understand the need to address the different groups because the solutions are usually different or are expected to be different, when actually the solutions are all based on human care, although the stressors may be different. As you know, we had Lisa Greenhill as a guest earlier. We had a big discussion about resiliency and the expectation of resiliency, whether it was appropriate or not, whether we should be including it in our admissions process, et cetera. Would you mind sharing some of the things that colleges of veterinary medicine are doing in response to their concern for well-being for any or all of these sectors of concern?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible work that Mackenzie Peterson has done with us at AAVMC. We brought Mackenzie on as the director for well-being about 3 years ago, right at the front end of the pandemic, right when the stress factors were, going off the wall, right? And what Mackenzie brought to us was, first of all, an incredible group of resources that she developed for the schools to use in terms of guidelines and things like that, and how to deal with the issues that they were facing. But more important, she brought to us a framework of how to address well-being. And the way that we describe it now is it goes from the micro level to the meso level to the macro level. At the micro level is the individual care. That's kind of one-on-one care. And over the last decade, what we've seen is now nearly all of our schools and colleges have dedicated professional counselors to assist students, sometimes faculty and staff, but primarily students, if they are experiencing distress. And they can go in and see a counselor and deal with their individual problem. That's the one-on-one approach. And by the way, is hugely important because most every student will experience stress. It's a stressful environment, and giving them the techniques and tools to deal with that and also to seek appropriate care when they need to is an absolute bare minimum essential. The meso level is the community in which the college operates. So it begins at the entire college, extends to the university, typically the campus, and then the community in which the university is located. And you have to deal with the well-being of that entire community or deal with some of the systemic problems or the environment that may be influencing the conditions there. And then the macro level, that's where AAVMC operates. And that's where we bring our member institutions together to, talk about sharing ideas that have worked, trying out new and different things, trying to change the very environment in which veterinary medicine operates. By the way, it's not unique to well-being. These things typically are about culture, the culture of the community, of the organization. And here's the thing about culture. Every organization has one. It's not
whether they know it or not.
It's there. There is a culture. It just may not be the one that you want it to be. And so what most organizations do is they're trying to deal with the problems of a dysfunctional culture by, putting out fires. Okay, there's a conflict here. Oh, we got to fix that. There's a challenge over here. We got to fix that one. Instead of looking back at what is the culture of this college, of this university, what do we need to change here to prevent some of these problems from occurring in the first place? When it comes to well-being, there's a number of things that we do, I believe unintentionally, that just make it stupidly difficult for people to get by, whether it's requiring specific hours of attendance here and there and without giving people flexibility where we can. And I know that, of course, there's the realities of we got to have coverage in the clinics. Yeah, I think we get that. But what can we do to give people the maximum flexibility so that they retain some degree of autonomy over their lives? People with children, with other care responsibilities, how are we meeting their needs? And I think there's a lot of things we can do there.
Well, I was waiting for Phil to jump in there. So, and you may be reticent to answer this, but has the pool of applicants changed such that, but the education system maybe hasn't changed, or have they both changed to increase the concerns and the stressors? I mean, the three of us went to veterinary school. Somehow we survived. Back then, I remember, look to your left, look to your right. One of you is not going to be there at graduation. I don't think they do that any longer. It's like, look to your left, look to your right. You're all here to support each other. But is there a generational difference in the students that is entering into the curriculums that makes them a little bit, I don't want to use the term softer, but I will because now I can get slapped by Phil or somebody else. But is there a generational difference that maybe increases the level of stress? That's on one side. Or is there such a huge cultural difference within the educational system that increases it? I mean, I'm not sure where are the problems, or do we even know?
So I think it's both, which is, of course, the easiest answer to any question. When it's an either or, it's elements of both. But here's what I would say. Let us reflect for a moment on our own experiences going through veterinary school several decades ago. Stress was there. So was an absence of well-being. So were mental health concerns and issues. The difference is we weren't talking about them. As a matter of fact, we actively avoided talking about them. It would be considered, grounds for dismissal if any student ever admitted to having, I'm feeling depressed. But there were people who were depressed. There were people who were self-medicating inappropriately, whether with alcohol or other drugs, right? That was pretty commonplace. So on the one hand, I would say we are without doubt in a much healthier place today because we have been successful at least slightly destigmatizing mental health issues. We're not all the way there. We've got a long ways to go. And so that's number one. Let's not pretend that everything was great when we all went to school and we were tougher and we were better and we didn't have those problems. Those problems were always there. We just didn't talk about them.
First of all, I totally agree with you. We should start with our perspective, with what we went through, right? And the environmental conditions were even different then. We did not have social media. We didn't even have cell phones. We didn't have GPS.
We didn't have PowerPoint.
We didn't have computers. We only had 3 stations to get our news from. I hate to say this, but life was simpler then, both physically and psychologically. And so we have to be careful about comparing ourselves to what these students are going through. I'm not even sure I know what my children went through, let alone my grandchildren. And so I think the answer to your question is, are they different? The answer is hell yes. Simply because of what they had to go through. We didn't have cyberbullying. My bullies were physical. My bullies hit me in the face. They didn't hit me in the psyche. And I think that was the basis of how we looked at mental health too, because of the paucity of threats. We didn't understand the mental derangements that could occur at the time. And so for those people who did suffer and were unable to adapt to mental challenges, they weren't getting a lot of help. And the fact that we just had a senator sign himself into the hospital, and there doesn't appear to be a real threat. The fact that he was elected, and we knew he suffered from depression. I don't remember the senator's name now, but there was a time when it was a big turmoil about the possibility of a former president getting psychological treatment while in office.
It was Tom Eagleton, who was a candidate for vice president.
That's what it was, yes.
And the key is, if something happened to the president, he would become president, but he had a history of being treated for depression. And you're right, Phil, that was a factor that lost that election. What you just mentioned about social media, and you're right, the world is different today than it was when we went to school, and it is changing at an exponential rate. So even 20 years after we went to school, it wasn't much different, but now that it's approaching 40 years, it is significantly different. And, CDC just published within the last week their study about teenage girls and the significant mental health issues, what's a combination of sexual assault and mental health and thoughts of suicide all wrapped up in it. But in terms of the mental health and suicidal ideology, they linked it to use of social media, then leads to poor body self-image. And you're right, all the cyberbullying and things like that. And given that we have a lot of young women who enter our schools, we may be seeing a disproportionate share of that. I don't know what the CDC data shows about young boys. I didn't see that published in the newspaper, but the study about young girls was alarming.
You said something interesting, both of you, that we had a problem, we just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So I was at one of my class reunions recently, and we had an entering class of 80 and graduated 65, which I wasn't even aware of at the time, because you are so heads down, nose to the grindstone, that you don't even sometimes recognize that some people have fallen by the wayside. But I didn't learn until class reunion that one of my classmates was dealing with depression as she was going through the curriculum, because you didn't talk about it. You hid behind being tough, being strong, the bottle of whatever was in the bottle. So I think there is so much more awareness now than there was, and much more sensitivity to it as a topic that is very important. I have a daughter who is graduating, yay, off the payroll, from Oregon State University in June. And I have spent the last 4 years trying to make sure that I listened for cues and keys that were indicative of her having difficulty, especially during the COVID times. And I just need to do a shout out and say she has been extremely strong and very mature as she has gone through the program, in not only balancing herself, but also helping others around her deal with some of the issues that they've had. Because by having a willingness to converse and to listen and to help, we have gone from a focus on the individual to a focus on the needs of the group. And I think we see more and more of that within the students as well.
I couldn't agree more. And having met your daughter, I understand the strength. But going back to your question and Andy's initial answer, I just want to emphasize that it is both. Even the question tends to say, duh, of course it's both. But when you say, has the population changed? Our previous conversation says, yep, there's a gender difference. There's diversity differences when we went to school, and the stressors are different. But the example you made also illustrates that difference. Not only is there a difference in the population of students, but there's a difference in the class environment too. The fact that when we went to school, competition was the primary word. And when they said, look to your left, look to your right, 3 of you won't be here, won't graduate, that was to promote competition. But now most colleges have a collaborative, supportive process and curriculum, and our culture is designed around that. And I don't know which came first, but I think it's for the better. I also think it's necessary when you look at the changes in our environment.
So let's look forward. Now that we look back, now let's look forward. What can we do as a profession? And a lot of it we may be doing already. What can we do as a profession to strengthen the mindset of students as they go through the curriculum, protect them once they get out? Because as we all know, we've got an attrition going on of veterinarians very quickly once they're out of school. And, I think we have to start to look at what can we do going forward to address the issues and make sure that we provide a great and strong foundation for all members of our profession, and they're ultimately contributing to the world. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important thing that I talked to you in my last discussion about, my military experience. And these are the things that we would call a force multiplier, meaning that whatever you can do to avoid attrition, whether it's due to injury or other things like that, then you've actually increased, you've allowed the force to, remain at that level. So you're right. If as a profession, we're already facing shortages across the spectrum in all areas. And when we lose somebody to either a premature retirement because of burnout, or they're of depression or lack of well-being, and they're harming themselves physically and emotionally, then we're losing that trained workforce that if we could eliminate those problems, they'd be able to do the work. So one of the things we can do is in the curriculum is to teach students, give students the tools that they need to, number one, be mindful of their own well-being and learn how to assess it. How am I feeling today? What am I doing good? What am I not doing good? and then give them the tools to be able to take corrective action. And that's kind of a fundamental part about well-being as I understand it. Now, I'm not a subject matter expert, but I can look at some of the materials that I've seen and notice that a lot of it has to do with self-empowerment, being able to control your environment, your life situation to the extent you can. Much of the problems we see in well-being are due to a sense of being powerless and not being able to control the stressors in your life. And sometimes that's merely perception. But as with all perceptions, they likely have a basis in fact and in objective truth. So the first key is to kind of change a mindset and say, okay, wait a minute, there may be things that I can do to control this environment that I'm in, to control my sleeping hours, to control my working hours, to control my diet, to do these things. There may be ways I can, through cognitive behavioral therapy, change the way that I react to a situation. Instead of getting panicky and worried, maybe I can learn to lower my stress level. Now, let me be clear, as I've heard other people say, yoga and meditation is not a panacea. You cannot downward dog your way out of a bad environment. So there are times you have to change the environment, and you can't just do a bunch of ohms and be over it.
I think that's really important, and I want to repeat that I don't think any of us are mental wellness experts here, but it is important to discuss the level of understanding safely. And whenever we go into a new area, the real problem is language, isn't it? And we will always be chastised by the experts by not being comprehensive enough or accurate enough in our language. But at least we're attempting to address it. The challenges of the schools is to recognize the challenges of their students. I want to be clear that when we talk about the issues of mental wellness, we're not talking about weaknesses in mental integrity or weaknesses in resilience. We're talking about responses that seem being overwhelmed by situations. We have a considerable number, increase in number of students who have food shortages, who are suffering from housing issues, who are worried about making their rent and worried that they may not have a place to study quietly. All those things add to their concern about their success. For most of us, it wasn't a real problem until we failed the test. We worried about taking the test, and if we passed the test, we were ready to go for the next one. But if I'm hungry after I pass the test, there are certain chronic debilitating situations that wear on these students that we didn't have to deal with. Financial insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity are all issues. And I'm not saying it didn't occur in our generation. I had classmates that slept in their cars in order to get by. But we have a larger percentage of that now that we have to deal with and we have to address. But then the next stage is our employers need to know where our graduates are coming from, who our graduates are. And the older the employer, the more that employer may have to learn. You know, that individual, that new associate that they just hired may not be able to buy a house immediately because of their student debt. And they may have to make a choice between a house and a car, or an apartment and their children. Those are the kind of decisions that they're prepared to make, but life could be easier if we understood their challenges.
Yeah, but you brought up something that we hadn't even covered in either of our conversations, and that's student debt. Because when we went to veterinary school, the schools that we went to got some help from the states at which we attended. And so the cost of education, relatively speaking, from an economic standpoint, was significantly lower than it is now. And I don't recall student debt even being a real conversation when we were in veterinary school into the same level and degree that it is now. And you want to talk about a stressor on top of food and housing and competition, implied or real. Add student debt as the mixer, and I can have huge empathy for many of these students as they go through the curriculum and as they continue outside of the curriculum and try to integrate themselves into the real world that's out there and deal with rent and car payments and insurance and all of these things that they've never had to deal with before. So we hadn't talked about student debt, but really, if you want to talk about a stressor for many of them, I would suggest that's as significant as any.
Well, I totally agree with you, but I this time it's my turn to say we're running out of time. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask Andy if you would like to address that. This will be the last question. We won't be able to have an in-depth discussion on student debt in this segment, but maybe we can invite Andy back.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good topic for further discussion. What I would say is that a couple of things on the front end. The cost of veterinary medical education is not much different from the cost of medical school education. They're comparable. Both the average of public schools and private schools is highly comparable. The indebtedness of veterinary students when they graduate is about equivalent to medical schools when they graduate. The big difference is salaries, both starting salaries and lifetime salaries. So I would say that I'm not sure that we necessarily have a tuition problem. I think the cost of educating a veterinarian is similar to the cost of educating a physician. I mean, there's probably some room for some efficiencies in those costs. The bigger problem is what can we do to work on the salary side of things? And indeed, with the very recent, meaning kind of during and after the pandemic, starting salaries are up for new graduates. And in fact, our debt to income ratio for new graduates is coming down. So that is encouraging. But there is still an entire cohort of about 10 years worth of graduates who incurred very high debt and started at very modest starting salaries. And all the evidence shows that the sooner you get your starting salary, the sooner in your career you start building your salary, the better off you're going to be on debt. That cohort is going to move through the system without that benefit. So that's still a real problem. And I guess in terms of how it relates to our discussion today, I agree, Peter. It's a significant cause of anxiety and stress. The good news is that at least on some fronts, it is ameliorating because of the good economy for starting salaries for veterinarians today.
And I would add that there are two other issues here that I think will come up in our future discussion. But one is how sustainable is the increase in salaries that we're seeing that we have to address, and the other cause of that cohortal issue was how we paid for that tuition and how society looks at the support of some of its important professions and education in general. And I don't think we can have this discussion without discussing the peculiar aspect of society's view on education and how it's supported.
So there I went and opened up Pandora's box, and then I just got it slammed on me. So before you go, I just want to show you what, if I can, I just want to show you what Whitey looked like. Sorry.
Oh, you found the picture. Oh, look at that.
Wow.
All right. That's from like 1965. So there you go.
So I'm going to say something crass here. You know, I was told that a drop of black meant you were black.
Hey, Andy, thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning about you and having this conversation. I am sorry that we have never had anything more than a nanosecond together, but I look forward to having a conversation sometime without a screen in front of us. So thank you so much.
Well, likewise, Peter, and I perhaps at some other event we'll be able to enjoy a conversation over an adult beverage. That's oftentimes how Phil and I have had some of our greatest discussions,
Yes, we have.
and there have been many.
Yes, there have been. I definitely want to thank Dr. Andrew Maccabe for being our guest and for your eloquent and challenging answers. Of course, I want to thank my partner, Peter Weinstein, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation that's been going on for about 3 years. To our listeners, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.